They didn't leave because the love was gone. They walked away while still carrying feelings for you they were too afraid to face. And after keeping the real reason buried for far too long, they finally admitted what actually happened. It wasn't because you weren't enough. It wasn't because you failed them. The truth behind that final goodbye changes the meaning of your entire love story. Listen carefully, because for a long time, their silence may have made you believe you already had your answer. When they became distant, stopped fighting for the connection, and finally chose to walk away, it probably looked like a decision made without hesitation. From your side, there was no explanation strong enough to make sense of it. So naturally, you may have gone back through every conversation in your mind, wondering what you said, what you missed, or what you could have done differently. You may have questioned whether you loved too deeply, trusted too much, or held on to something they had already decided to leave behind. But that's not what they finally admitted. They said the truth was almost the opposite. They walked away when their feelings for you were becoming stronger, not weaker. The closer the connection became, the more frightened they became of what choosing you would require from them. There were responsibilities they hadn't told you about, expectations from people around them, old promises they still felt trapped by. And somewhere in the middle of all of that pressure, they started convincing themselves that loving you openly would force them to change parts of their life they didn't yet have the courage to change. So instead of telling you the truth, they chose distance. And that decision became the mistake they've carried ever since. They admitted that shortly before everything fell apart, there was a serious conversation with someone close to them. That person asked whether they were truly ready to build a future with you. At first, they defended what the two of you had. They talked about the way you understood them. They admitted that the connection felt different from anything they'd experienced before. They even said there were parts of themselves they could only be honest about when they were with you. Then the conversation changed. Family expectations were brought up. Responsibilities were brought up. Promises made long before you entered their life were brought back into the picture. And suddenly, what should have been a decision about love became a decision about fear. They began imagining who might be disappointed if they chose you. They worried about conflict, judgment, consequences, and all the things that might fall apart around them. Instead of trusting you enough to tell you what they were facing, they made the decision for both of you. They told themselves that walking away would protect you from being pulled into their problems. They thought disappearing would hurt less. Now they know how wrong that was, because their silence didn't protect you. It left you without the information you needed to understand what had happened. You were left looking at yourself for answers while they were carrying the real explanation alone. And one of the hardest parts of their confession was admitting that they knew you might be blaming yourself. They saw it. They understood it, and still, for a long time, they said nothing. There were many moments when they almost reached out. They would open a message, type a few words, then delete everything before sending it. Sometimes they would look at your name and remember conversations about the future. Other times, they would replay the last moments between you and wonder how something that once felt so real had ended with so little explanation. Every time they came close to contacting you, fear stopped them again. At first, they called it doing the right thing. Later, they admitted it was pride, and underneath the pride was shame. They knew that contacting you meant admitting they hadn't left, because the connection meant nothing. It meant confessing that they had run from something they actually wanted. But then they revealed something even deeper about the day they walked away. A part of them hoped you would stop them, not because you were supposed to chase them. Not because it was your responsibility to rescue the relationship, but emotionally, they were torn in two directions. One part wanted to escape everything that frightened them. Another part wanted some impossible sign that the love between you was powerful enough to survive all of it. When that moment passed, both of you were left with different versions of the same ending. You saw someone choosing to leave you. They saw themselves giving up something they loved because they believed they had no other choice. And that's where the regret began. Life kept moving. Responsibilities continued. People around them assumed they had moved on. They learned how to appear unaffected whenever your name came up. They learned how to act as though the past had been settled. But memories don't always disappear just because someone refuses to speak about them. Small things kept bringing you back. A song, a familiar place, a conversation with someone who didn't understand them the way you once did. The memory of how you could tell something was wrong even when they insisted everything was fine. And slowly, they began to understand that what they had lost wasn't just another relationship. They had lost the one connection where they felt completely seen. That realization became harder to avoid. Recently, someone close to them finally asked the question they had spent years avoiding. If walking away was really the right decision, why are you still trying to justify it? This time, they couldn't hide behind the old explanation. Everything came out. The fear, the outside pressure, the obligations, the guilt. the belief that leaving you was somehow protecting you. And finally, the sentence they had refused to say aloud. They didn't walk away because they stopped loving you. They walked away because they were terrified of what choosing that love would force them to confront. Then came the question that changed everything. They were asked, if you could go back to that final moment knowing what you know now, would you still leave? Their answer was immediate. No, they admitted that losing you taught them something they couldn't understand at the time. A decision can feel safe in one moment and still become the deepest regret of your life later. They had spent too long telling themselves they chose peace, when what they really chose was fear. And after finally saying all of that out loud, they did something nobody expected. They didn't just confess the truth. They asked whether there might still be a way to tell you everything themselves. Because after all this time, they no longer want you carrying the blame for a goodbye that was never truly about you. But the confession didn't end there. Because once they admitted that fear, not lack of love, was the real reason they walked away, another truth surfaced that was even harder for them to say out loud. There had been one specific moment before the separation when they nearly chose you. They had already made up their mind. They were going to stop listening to everyone else, stop allowing outside pressure to control the future, and finally tell you exactly what they wanted. For a brief moment, they were ready to risk everything. Then something happened behind your back. Someone they trusted pulled them aside and gave them a warning that changed the entire direction of the relationship. They were told that choosing you would create consequences they weren't prepared for. Not just arguments, not just disappointment. They were made to believe that people close to them would turn against them completely. And because they were already emotionally overwhelmed, that warning hit them at exactly the wrong moment. The person speaking to them knew their weakest points. They knew which fears to trigger. They knew which responsibilities to mention. They knew exactly how to make your connection feel dangerous instead of beautiful. And slowly, doubt entered a place where love had once felt certain. What hurts them now is knowing they never gave you the chance to answer any of it. They never came to you and said, "This is what I'm being told." They never asked whether the two of you could face the pressure together. They never gave the relationship a fair chance to survive the truth. Instead, they carried every warning alone until fear became louder than their own heart. Then they made the decision that changed both of your lives. They pulled away, and the moment they did, they expected relief. But relief never came. The first few days were filled with confusion. They kept telling themselves they had done what was necessary. They repeated the same explanation again and again. It was better this way, but deep inside, something didn't feel right. They missed the conversations they used to have with you. They missed the safety of being understood without having to explain every emotion. They missed the simple comfort of knowing there was one person who could recognize when they were pretending to be okay. And every time they remembered that person was you, the decision became harder to defend. Still, they refused to admit it. For months, they tried to convince themselves that time would erase the connection. They stayed busy. They distracted themselves. They surrounded themselves with people. They made choices that looked like moving forward, but privately, they were measuring everything against what they had experienced with you. Every conversation felt different. Every connection felt incomplete. Every attempt to replace what was lost only reminded them of what they had walked away from. And then something happened that they weren't expecting. They heard someone mention your name. Just your name, nothing dramatic. No message from you, no big confrontation. But the second they heard it, their entire expression changed. Someone standing nearby noticed. They asked, "Why does that name still affect you like that?" At first, they denied it. They laughed it off. They said it was old history, but the person didn't believe them. And eventually, the question came again. If it's really over inside you, why are you still reacting like you lost something? That question stayed with them. Late that night, they were alone, replaying everything. The beginning, the closeness, the promises, the misunderstandings, the moment fear entered, the final goodbye. And for the first time, they stopped asking whether leaving had been necessary. They asked a different question. What if I made the biggest mistake of my life? That question terrified them. Because if the answer was yes, then all the pain they had been trying to justify suddenly meant something different. It meant they hadn't protected themselves. They had abandoned something rare. And from that night forward, the regret became impossible to ignore. They started remembering details they had tried to bury. The way you stayed when things became difficult. The way you listened when they struggled to put their feelings into words. The way you saw potential in them when they were doubting themselves. The way you never demanded perfection. You only wanted honesty. And that last part became the hardest memory of all, because honesty was exactly what they failed to give you. They admitted that you deserved the truth before they walked away. You deserved to know what they were afraid of. You deserved to know who was influencing them. You deserved the chance to decide whether the problems were too much for you. Instead, they made that decision without you. And now they understand why that silence may have hurt more than the goodbye itself. But there was something else they admitted, something they had never told anyone before. On the day they left, they kept one thing connected to you. It wasn't something expensive. It wasn't something anyone else would understand. But to them, it carried a memory of the relationship. They kept it hidden. Through every attempt to move on, it stayed with them. There were nights when they would take it out and just stare at it, sometimes for seconds, sometimes much longer, and every time the same thought returned. I walked away from someone I still loved. That hidden reminder became proof that their heart had never fully accepted the decision their fear had made. Years, or what felt like years emotionally, could pass and still that truth remained. Then recently, they finally showed that hidden reminder to someone they trusted. And when the person asked why they had kept it for so long, they couldn't give the old excuses anymore. They simply said, because a part of me never left. That was the moment everything changed. For the first time, someone else knew how deep the regret really was. They knew the truth wasn't about missing attention. It wasn't about loneliness. It wasn't about nostalgia. This person was still emotionally connected to the life they once imagined with you. And once that truth was spoken, another question came. Then why haven't you told them? Their answer revealed how much fear still remains. They said they don't know whether you would even want to hear from them now. They don't know whether too much time has passed. They don't know whether you have healed, changed, moved forward, or closed that chapter completely. And perhaps most painfully, they don't know whether they still have the right to interrupt your peace after being the one who created the distance. But the person listening told them something they couldn't forget. You may not have the right to ask for another chance, but they still deserved the truth. Those words hit them hard, because suddenly this wasn't about getting you back. It was about finally giving you what they should have given you from the beginning. An explanation, an apology, the truth. And now they are considering doing something they have avoided for a very long time. They are thinking about contacting you directly, not through someone else, not through hints, not through silence and hope, directly. But before they do, there is one final truth they feel they have to confess first. Because the person who pressured them to walk away didn't just warn them about the future. That person told them something specific about you, something they believed without ever asking you whether it was true. And now they have discovered that what they were told may have been a lie that could have changed the entire ending of your love story. And this is where the story becomes even more painful, because the thing they were told about you wasn't small. It wasn't some harmless misunderstanding. It was something designed to make them question whether the future they imagined with you was ever real. The person influencing them claimed that you had already decided to move on. They said you were only staying emotionally connected until something better came along. They made it sound as though your love had an expiration date. And because your person was already frightened, already overwhelmed, already looking for a reason to believe walking away was the safer choice, those words found their way into the deepest part of their fear. They didn't question it enough. They didn't come to you. They didn't ask you directly. They just started watching everything you did differently. A delayed reply suddenly looked suspicious. A quiet day suddenly felt like proof. A moment when you seemed tired or distant suddenly became evidence that maybe the warning was true. That is how fear works when someone has already planted doubt. It turns ordinary moments into signs of betrayal. And the more they overthought everything, the more they pulled away from you without explaining why. You may have felt the change. One day they were warm. The next day they were harder to reach. One moment they seemed completely invested. Then suddenly, it felt like you were talking to someone who had already emotionally placed one foot outside the relationship. You probably wondered what had changed. Now they have finally admitted it. They were reacting to a story about you that you never even knew existed. And there is something deeply painful about that, because you were being judged in a trial you didn't know was happening. You were being asked to prove loyalty without being told that loyalty was being questioned. You were expected to repair a fear you were never allowed to see. Meanwhile, the person who planted the doubt kept feeding it. Whenever your person started missing you, they were reminded of the warning. Whenever they considered choosing you, another question was raised. What if you give up everything and they leave anyway? What if you fight your family for someone who doesn't stay? What if you risk your entire future and regret it? Those questions became louder than the evidence right in front of them. The evidence that you cared, the evidence that you stayed, the evidence that your connection meant something. But eventually, reality caught up with the lie. Recently, your person crossed paths with someone who knew more about what happened during that time. The conversation wasn't planned. It started casually. Then your name came up. And your person finally admitted that one of the reasons they walked away was because they believed you had already been planning to leave. The other person looked confused, completely confused. They asked, "Who told you that?" When your person gave the name, the entire mood changed, because this person knew something your person didn't. They knew that during that same period, you had actually been doing the opposite. You had been trying to hold the connection together. You had been waiting for clarity. You had been wondering why someone who once seemed so certain had suddenly started slipping away. And apparently, there had even been a conversation where your loyalty had been made clear. But that information never reached your person. Instead, only the doubt reached them, only the warning, only the version of the story that made leaving seem necessary. Your person said they felt physically sick when they realized this. Because for the first time, they saw just how much of their decision had been built on assumptions. They started asking questions, a lot of questions. Who said what? When was it said? Why were certain things hidden? Why had someone been so determined to convince them that you couldn't be trusted? And the more answers they received, the worse it became, because it started to look less like misunderstanding and more like interference. Someone had wanted distance between the two of you. Maybe they thought they were protecting your person. Maybe they had their own reasons. Maybe they simply didn't believe the relationship should continue. But whatever their motive was, the result was the same. Fear was fed, trust was damaged, and instead of two people facing a problem together, you were separated before the real conversation could ever happen. That realization broke something open inside them. They went back through old memories with completely different eyes. Arguments that once seemed like proof you were drifting away suddenly looked like moments when you were simply confused by their behavior. Times when they thought you were becoming guarded now made sense because they had already started withdrawing. Even your final conversations looked different. They finally understood that while they were silently testing whether you would stay, you were probably wondering why they had stopped giving you anything solid to hold on to. And that realization brought them to tears, not because they could change the past, but because they finally understood how unfair the past had been to you. They admitted something else too. After walking away, there were several moments when they almost came back. One time, they even traveled part of the way toward a place connected to you. They had rehearsed what they would say. They were ready to admit that leaving had been a mistake, but before they could follow through, the same fear returned. What if they hate me now? What if they tell me it's too late? What if I hear the answer I deserve? So they turned around. Another chance disappeared. Later, they wrote a message. A long one, not 2 sentences, not some casual "how have you been?" It was an actual confession. They wrote that they had never stopped caring. They wrote that they regretted leaving. They wrote that there were things you didn't know about why they made that decision. They wrote that they wanted to explain everything. Then they stared at the message for a long time and deleted it. They said deleting that message became one of the moments they regret almost as much as the original goodbye, because they know that every time they chose silence, they allowed you to keep living with an incomplete version of the truth. But this time feels different. This time, the lie they believed has been exposed. This time, they can't hide behind the excuse that leaving was necessary. This time, they know they made a decision about your heart without ever asking what was actually in it. And now they are facing the question they have avoided for too long. What do you do when you discover that you walked away from the greatest love of your life partly because you believed something that was never true? There is no easy answer. They know an apology cannot erase the pain. They know regret does not automatically create another chance. They know you may have become stronger without them. You may have rebuilt parts of yourself they once broke, and they understand that coming back into your life cannot be about demanding anything from you. But they also know they cannot continue pretending you were the reason they left. Because you weren't, their fear was, their silence was, their lack of courage was, and someone else's influence made all of it worse. Now the person who originally planted that doubt has apparently realized that the truth is coming out. And according to what your person confessed, that individual recently reached out again. But this time, they weren't warning them to stay away from you. They were trying to explain why they interfered in the first place. And what they admitted about their real reason for keeping the two of you apart could change everything your person thought they understood about the breakup. What they admitted next made everything even harder to accept. Because the person who had interfered between the two of you finally confessed that they were never completely certain about the things they had said about you. They had taken assumptions, fears, and pieces of incomplete information and presented them as facts. And your person believed them. That was the part that hurt the most. There had been no undeniable proof that you were planning to leave, no message from you saying you didn't care, no real evidence that your love had disappeared. There had only been fear repeated so many times that it eventually started sounding like truth. The person who interfered admitted that they were afraid your relationship would change everything around them. They worried your person would become less dependent on the family. They worried old routines would disappear. They worried decisions that once required everyone's approval would suddenly become decisions made between the two of you. And instead of admitting that fear, they tried to make you look like the danger. That confession hit your person hard, because suddenly they could see something they had been blind to for far too long. The closer the two of you became, the more certain people around them started feeling threatened by the connection, not because you had done anything wrong, but because love was giving your person confidence. You were encouraging them to think for themselves. You were reminding them that their life belonged to them. And for someone who had spent years being controlled by expectations, that kind of love was powerful. Maybe too powerful for certain people around them. So little doubts were introduced, one sentence at a time, one warning at a time, one uncomfortable question at a time. Are you sure they really understand you? Are you sure they'll stay when things become difficult? What happens when they want you to choose between them and us? Do you really know what they want from you? None of those questions sounded dangerous on their own. But repeated over time, they changed the way your person looked at the relationship. And eventually, they stopped listening to what their own experience with you was telling them. That is what they regret now. Because their own experience had always told them something completely different. You were there when they were struggling. You didn't disappear when things became complicated. You didn't demand that they become someone else. You simply wanted honesty, consistency, and a real chance to build something together. But instead of trusting what they had personally experienced with you, they trusted people who were afraid of losing control over them. And once they finally understood that anger replaced regret for a moment, they confronted the person who had interfered, not gently, not carefully. They asked why they had been so willing to damage something they knew mattered deeply. At first, the person defended themselves. They said they were trying to protect them. They said they believed the relationship would create problems. They said they thought walking away would eventually make life easier. But your person asked a question they couldn't answer. Easier for who? The room reportedly went quiet, because that was the truth nobody had wanted to admit. Maybe walking away had made life easier for the people around them, but it had never made life easier for the person who actually had to live with losing you. They had carried the regret. They had carried the unanswered questions. They had spent nights wondering what could have happened if they had been brave enough to make their own decision. And now, after all this time, they were finally looking at the person who helped create that ending. They said, "You made me afraid of losing everything if I chose them, but nobody warned me what I would lose if I didn't." That sentence changed the entire conversation, because there was nothing left to argue. Your person had already lived the consequence. They knew exactly what walking away had cost them, and they were done pretending otherwise. After that confrontation, they left alone. They didn't call anyone. They didn't go looking for advice. They simply drove for a while, thinking about every decision that had brought them to this point. Eventually, they stopped somewhere quiet, and that was where they finally broke down. Not because someone had forced them, not because someone was watching, but because years of holding everything inside had finally become too heavy. They cried over the goodbye. They cried over the silence. They cried over every message they never sent. They cried over the possibility that you had spent all this time believing you were rejected because you weren't loved enough. And they admitted that thought hurts them more than anything else. Because whatever mistakes they made, the love itself had never been the problem. The problem was that they were too afraid to protect it, and that difference matters. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't automatically repair anything. But for the first time, they wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of their own heart. They wanted you to know. So they did something they had avoided for far too long. They started writing again. This time, they didn't write a vague message. They didn't try to sound casual. They didn't pretend they were just checking in. They wrote everything. They admitted that they had listened to people they shouldn't have. They admitted that they believed things about you without giving you a chance to explain. They admitted that fear had controlled their decision. They admitted that leaving had never brought the peace they expected. And then they wrote the hardest line. "I know I may have lost the right to ask for another chance, but I never want you to believe I walked away because you weren't enough." They stared at that sentence for a long time. Because it was the sentence they should have told you years ago. Then they continued. They explained that the connection had mattered more than they ever allowed themselves to say. They explained that after the separation, they had spent too much time pretending they were fine because admitting regret felt humiliating. They admitted they had compared every connection afterward to the one they had with you. And nothing ever felt the same. They weren't saying that to manipulate you. They weren't trying to make you responsible for their happiness. They simply wanted to finally tell the truth without protecting their pride. But when the message was almost finished, they stopped again. Their finger hovered over the send button. The old fear returned immediately. What if you had moved on? What if you never wanted to hear their name again? What if this confession opened a wound you had already worked hard to close? For several minutes, they couldn't move. Then they remembered the words someone had told them earlier. They may not owe you another chance. But they deserved the truth, and for the first time, they understood that sending the message wasn't supposed to guarantee a certain answer. It was supposed to end the lie, so they decided they would send it. But before they could, another message appeared on their phone. A message from someone they had not expected to hear from. It came from the same person who had originally convinced them that you were preparing to leave. And this time, the message contained something they had apparently kept hidden for years. Something directly connected to you. Something that proved you had tried to reach your person before everything ended. And if what was inside that message is real, then your person didn't just walk away because they were afraid. They may have walked away without ever knowing that you had already tried to save the relationship. The message contained a screenshot. At first, your person didn't understand what they were looking at. Then they saw the date. It was from the final days before everything collapsed between the two of you. And underneath the date was something they had never seen before. A message from you, not angry, not cold, not distant. You had been trying to reach them. You had written that you could feel something changing between you. You had asked whether something was wrong. You had made it clear that if they were scared, confused, or under pressure, you wanted them to talk to you instead of disappearing. And then came the line that completely shattered the story they had believed for years. You had written that you were still willing to fight for the relationship. Your person read it once, then again, then again. Because this was the exact opposite of what they had been told. They had spent all this time believing you were preparing to walk away, but while they were secretly withdrawing from you, you had been trying to hold on. The message had never reached them. Someone had seen it first. Someone had decided they knew what was best, and instead of allowing your person to read your words and make their own decision, they had kept the message from them. That realization brought back every emotion at once. Anger, guilt, shock, grief, and beneath all of it, one brutal question. What would I have done if I had seen this back then? They already knew the answer. They would have called you. They would have told you everything. They would have admitted the pressure they were under. They would have told you about the warnings. They would have asked whether the two of you could face everything together. Maybe the ending would still have been difficult. Maybe there still would have been obstacles. But at least the decision would have belonged to the two people actually living the love story. Instead, somebody else had helped decide the ending. Your person called the individual immediately. This time there was no hesitation. They demanded to know why the message had been hidden. At first, there was silence. Then excuses. They said emotions were high. They said your person had already seemed determined to walk away. They said they thought showing the message would only make everything harder. But your person wasn't accepting excuses anymore. They asked, "Did you know they were trying to save us?" Another silence. Then came the answer. Yes, that one word changed everything. Because now there was no misunderstanding left to hide behind. The person had known. They knew you had not given up. They knew you were asking for a conversation. They knew your person was making a permanent decision with incomplete information, and they allowed it to happen anyway. Your person asked the only question that mattered. Why? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was selfish. The person admitted they believed your relationship would pull your person away from the life everyone else had planned for them. They didn't trust what would happen if your person started making decisions based on love instead of obligation. They were afraid of change, afraid of losing influence, afraid that once your person truly chose you, they would stop allowing everyone else to control the direction of their life. So they convinced themselves that interfering was justified. They called it protection. Your person called it what it really was, control. And for the first time, they refused to soften the truth. They said, "You didn't protect me. You took away my choice." That confrontation ended differently from every conversation they had ever had before. Your person didn't ask for permission. They didn't ask what anyone thought they should do next. They simply ended the call. Then they sat there staring at your old message. The message you had sent believing it would reach them. The message you probably assumed they had ignored. And that thought was almost unbearable. Because from your side, you may have believed they saw your final attempt and chose silence anyway. You may have carried that rejection for years. Meanwhile, they had never even known the message existed. For the first time, your person understood that there were two completely different versions of the breakup. In your version, you reached out, you tried, you waited, and eventually you had to accept silence. In their version, they believed you were already preparing to leave, so they walked away before you could reject them. Two people. Still caring, still afraid, still waiting for honesty. Separated by information neither of them fully had. Your person broke down again when that reality finally sank in. They said there was one thought they couldn't escape. You probably thought I saw it. That thought hurt them deeply, because now they imagined you watching your phone, waiting, wondering whether they would respond. maybe checking one last time before accepting that there would be no answer. And your person finally understood something they had never understood before. Their silence had spoken for them, even when they never consciously chose what it was saying. To you, silence may have said, "I don't care." But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that fear, interference, and missing information had created a goodbye neither of you fully understood. Your person then went back to the confession message they had been writing, but now everything had changed. There was more they needed to say. They added the truth about your old message. They wrote that they had only just discovered it. They explained that they had never seen it before. They told you that if they had received those words when you sent them, they believed the entire story might have unfolded differently. Then they stopped because they knew how dangerous that sentence could sound. They didn't want to rewrite history. They didn't want to pretend all the blame belonged to someone else, so they added something important. They admitted that even if somebody interfered, they were still responsible for the way they handled their fear. They should have come to you. They should have asked questions. They should have trusted the connection enough to have one honest conversation. Nobody forced them to remain silent. That part belonged to them, and they wanted you to know they understood it. This wasn't going to be an apology built around excuses. It was going to be an apology built around responsibility. They wrote that they were sorry for allowing outside voices to become louder than the person they claimed to love. They were sorry for making you carry questions that should have been answered. They were sorry if you ever believed their departure meant you were easy to leave. And they were especially sorry that your final attempt to reach them had been hidden while they were being convinced that you no longer cared. Then they reached the end. The message was long, raw, nothing polished, nothing carefully designed to protect their image, just the truth. They read the entire thing one final time. Their hands were shaking. This was the moment they had avoided again and again. There would be no controlling your reaction. You might answer, you might not, you might forgive them. You might decide forgiveness did not mean reopening the door. They finally understood that all of those possibilities belonged to you, and for once they were willing to respect that. They pressed send, then they put the phone down. Seconds passed, then minutes, nothing happened. They told themselves not to expect anything. After everything that had happened, they knew they had no right to demand an immediate response. But then the phone screen lit up. Your person froze. There was a notification. They picked up the phone slowly, almost afraid to look. And when they saw what appeared on the screen, their entire expression changed, because it wasn't the answer they had prepared themselves for. It was something that suggested you may have known more about the truth behind the separation than they ever realized. And the next conversation could finally reveal what you had been carrying all this time. The notification wasn't a full reply. It was a short message, just enough words to make their heart pound, because you hadn't responded with anger. You hadn't asked why they were suddenly reaching out. You hadn't told them to disappear. Instead, the message simply said that there were things they had never known either. Your person stared at those words for a long time. After everything they had just confessed, they had expected the past to finally make sense. But now it sounded as though there was another side to the story, a side you had carried alone. They typed a response, deleted it, then tried again. Finally, they asked the question that had been sitting inside them for years. What happened after I left? The answer didn't come immediately. And those few minutes felt heavier than the years of silence. Because suddenly, your person understood what it meant to wait for someone else to decide whether you deserved an explanation. They were experiencing a tiny piece of what you may have felt long ago. Then your reply came, and what you revealed completely changed the picture. You told them that after they pulled away, you had tried more than once to understand what was happening. You had reached out, you had tried to create opportunities for an honest conversation. You had even asked someone close to them whether there was something you had done wrong. But instead of getting clarity, you were told that your person had already made their decision. You were told that they wanted distance. You were told that continuing to reach out would only make things worse. So eventually you stopped, not because you stopped caring, because you believed respecting their choice was the only thing left for you to do. Your person read that part twice, then a third time. Because now another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. While they had been told you were preparing to leave, you had been told they wanted nothing more to do with the relationship. Both of you had been given information that pushed you in opposite directions. Both of you were waiting for the other to show they still cared, and both of you had been convinced that the silence meant rejection. Your person felt anger rising again, but this time, the anger wasn't only directed at the people who interfered. It was directed inward too, because they knew there had been one simple solution available the entire time. They could have spoken directly to you, one real conversation, one honest question, one moment of courage. That was all it might have taken to expose everything. Instead, pride and fear kept both of you on opposite sides of a silence neither of you fully understood. Then you revealed something even more painful. After the breakup, you had spent a long time wondering whether any of the love had been real. Not because you wanted to be dramatic, but because the ending had made no sense. Someone who once spoke about a future with you had suddenly behaved as if the entire connection could be erased without explanation. So you did what many people do when they are left without answers. You started creating your own. Maybe you weren't enough. Maybe they found someone better. Maybe everything they said had only been temporary. Maybe you had misunderstood the entire relationship. Your person's eyes filled with tears while reading that, because those were exactly the thoughts they never wanted you to carry, and yet their silence had created them. They wrote back immediately. They told you the love had been real. They told you the connection had been real. They told you there had never been a moment when your worth was the reason they left. But you didn't respond to that part right away. Instead, you asked something harder. If it was real, why didn't you trust me enough to tell me what was happening? Your person had no quick answer. There was no beautiful explanation that could make that question disappear, so they didn't try to defend themselves. They admitted the truth. They had been weak. They had been afraid. They had allowed other people's opinions to become more powerful than their own experience with you. They had convinced themselves they were protecting everyone from conflict when they were really avoiding conflict themselves. And in doing that, they had hurt the one person they claimed they were trying to protect. You read the message. Then there was silence again. But this silence felt different. It wasn't the cold silence of years ago. It was the silence of two people finally looking directly at the truth. And truth can be heavy when it arrives late. Your person didn't push. They didn't send 5 more messages. They didn't ask whether you still loved them. For the first time, they allowed you to decide the pace. Then another message came. You said there was something you had never told anyone, something that happened shortly after the separation. Your person immediately felt nervous. Because by now, every hidden detail seemed to expose another consequence of that final decision. You explained that there had been one night when you almost went to see them. You were tired of wondering. Tired of receiving explanations through other people. Tired of trying to decode silence. You had decided that even if the answer hurt, you wanted to hear it directly from them, so you made plans to go. But before you could, someone contacted you, someone from their side, and what that person told you stopped you completely. They said your person had already chosen another future. They said showing up would only embarrass you. They said the relationship was over, and that your person didn't want you interfering in the life they were building. Your person couldn't believe what they were reading, because they had never asked anyone to say those things. They had never told anyone you would embarrass yourself by coming. They had never said they wanted you erased. Somebody had spoken for them. Again, you continued. You said that conversation was the moment you finally gave up trying, not because your feelings disappeared that night, but because you believed there was no dignity left in chasing someone who apparently wanted you gone. So you went home, you cried, and then you made yourself a promise. You would never again force your way into a place where you were not wanted. That promise became part of how you survived the ending. Your person put the phone down after reading that. For several minutes, they couldn't respond, because now they understood that while they had spent years wondering why you didn't fight harder, you had actually tried. You had tried until somebody convinced you that continuing would only humiliate you. The person who kept asking, why didn't they come back, finally had the answer. You had been pushed away by words they never even knew were spoken. When they picked up the phone again, they apologized. Not once, not casually. They told you they were sorry that people had been allowed to speak for them. They were sorry they had created the kind of uncertainty where other people could control the story. They were sorry you had walked away believing you were unwanted. Then they asked who had contacted you that night. Your response came almost immediately, and the name on the screen made them go completely still, because it wasn't the person who had already confessed to hiding your earlier message. It was someone else. Someone your person had defended for years. Someone they believed had always supported the relationship. Someone who had looked them in the eyes after the breakup and said, if it was meant to work, they would have fought harder for you. Now your person realized that same individual may have been the reason you stopped fighting. And suddenly, the interference was bigger than either of you had understood. This wasn't one frightened person making one bad decision. There may have been more than one person working to keep the truth from reaching both sides. Your person asked you whether you still had the old message. You said yes, you had never deleted it. Then you sent the screenshot. The date was there, the name was there, and the words were impossible to deny. Your person looked at the screen and felt something inside them change, because regret was no longer enough. They needed answers. They needed to know why 2 different people had inserted themselves into a relationship that didn't belong to them. They needed to know how much had been hidden. And most of all, they needed to know whether there had been one person behind both of them. So your person made a decision. They were going to confront the second person directly. But before they could make the call, you sent one more message, a warning. You told them not to call yet, because there was something else you had kept from that night. Something the second person accidentally revealed while trying to convince you to stay away. A name neither of you had discussed yet. And when you finally typed that name onto the screen, your person realized the real reason behind your separation may have started long before either of you knew someone was trying to tear the relationship apart.